Hey everyone, I'm Jackie from Adam Heart Cross Stitch, and this video is all about pin stitches. Any variation you can think of, whether you're stitching on Aida or Evenweave, over 1 or over 2, we're going to cover it all right here. I love a pin stitch. You can work them so many different ways, whether you're using them to start or end your threads. There's like a whole arsenal you can have in your back pocket ready to go in a ton of different scenarios. Now, pin stitches are going to be worked a little bit differently depending on the type of fabric you're using, whether you're using an Aida or an even weave, and how many squares you're stitching over, whether you're stitching over 1 or over 2. So for the first half of the video, we're going to talk all about pin stitches when you're stitching over 1 on Aida. And the second half of the video will be focused on pin stitches when you're working on even weaves and linens. So when I'm stitching on Aida, I tend to use a lot of pin stitches. Typically, if I can't do like a standard loop start for whatever reason, the diagonal pin stitch is my next go-to when it comes to starting my threads. I also feel like pin stitches, specifically those worked on Aida, are the most secure type of starting or ending stitch. Like so much so that if you are frogging a thread, and you have a pin stitch in place, it can like actually be difficult to get it undone to remove it. So the first thing we need to talk about when it comes to working pin stitches on your Aida fabric is how the weave of the fabric itself is structured. So when you look closely at the fabric, you will see a basket weave of vertical and horizontal groupings of threads. The first types of pin stitches I'm going to show you can be worked either horizontally or vertically, and they're placed right into the weave of that fabric. And these can be used both for starting and ending your threads. All right, so when it comes to horizontal and vertical pin stitches, the trick is just making note of which way the weave of the fabric is running. So if we look at our squares here, you want to pay attention to the fibers along the top. So here, they're running horizontally. Next to it is vertically, horizontally, vertically, horizontally, so forth. It's a basket weave, so it's making that pattern. So whichever square you need to start in, you just need to pay attention to whether the top threads are running horizontally or vertically. So I'm going to start in this square right here. These threads are running vertically. And to start, I'm going to bring my needle down through the center. And I'm basically splitting the weave of those threads that are making up the fabric. All right. So I'm going to pull my needle down. I'm going to leave a little tail and just keep it pinned out of the way. And now I'm going to repeat this process on the top and bottom of the stitch, making sure that I'm keeping that same split of those threads. So now I'm going to go back down and then again repeat with the top. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and trim this tail. And when you give this a pull, like you can kind of see the remnant of the tail that I snipped, but otherwise that pin stitch is totally hidden within the weave of the fabric. So now I'm going to go ahead, make a few stitches, and you can see it will get completely covered up. And again, I find these to be super secure, like so much so that if you needed to frog this entire section, like it would actually be difficult to remove that pin stitch. All right, so that was a vertical pin stitch to start my thread. Now I'm going to show you a horizontal pin stitch to end it. What I like to do is just place it like right underneath or a few stitches away from wherever I'm ending it. I just like to place them in a spot that will eventually get covered by another stitch. They're pretty invisible, but that just like ensures that they disappear. So I'm going to come up just below this area. This time I'm coming up from the side of the stitch, again, splitting that horizontal weave of the fabric. And now I'm going to go down in the middle. You can see when you pull it tight, it basically disappears. And then repeat the same process on the other side. Now, again, I pull tight. I mean, it's barely visible. So you can imagine once that gets covered up with another stitch, you would barely see it. So flipping over to the back. So this is the tail from that horizontal pin stitch I just placed. I'm just gonna snip it. You can do it right up against the fabric, and that gives you an idea of what it looks like from the back. And now I'll just basically run through the same process. This time I'm going to place a horizontal pin stitch to start. For starting them, I like to start from the front, again, piercing through the center weave of that stitch. Leave a little bit of a tail. I'm going to come back up in the side, right back down in the middle, and then repeat on the other side. I'm going to go ahead and snip that out of the way. And now as we stitch this section, that starting pin stitch and the horizontal pin stitch we had from earlier will essentially both disappear. Again, as we approach that horizontal pin stitch we placed earlier, it is really going to disappear behind these new stitches that we are placing. So now if I wanted to end my thread, but I didn't want to place a pin stitch around this area, maybe none of this is going to be covered later on. You can do a hidden pin stitch, which is essentially, I know that this stitch right here is vertical, so I can place a pin stitch behind my little X that I've already made there. It's a little tricky and I don't even know if it's going to really translate to camera, but I'm going to go ahead and attempt to show you. So again, I know that this one is vertical, so I'm going to bring my needle up through the middle of the weave of that stitch along the bottom. And then I'm going to just kind of place my needle behind my stitch through the center. And pull tight. And I'm going to repeat that process on the top. And again, if it was a horizontal square, I would do it horizontally, but I know this one is vertical. Again, I'm going to manipulate it a little bit, just make sure I'm in the center. And then pull through. All right, and then I usually will just kind of take my needle to just kind of straighten my stitch back out. And then you just snip it from the back, and it's kind of like a really cool hidden way to secure your thread. What I really love about the horizontal and vertical pin stitches is that when they're done correctly, they just disappear into the weave of the fabric. And as cool as that is, they're actually not my favorite. By far, my favorite type of pin stitch and the one I use the most often is the diagonal pin stitch. So my favorite thing about the diagonal pin stitch is you're actually creating the bottom half of your stitch while you're securing your thread in place. So because of that, I tend to use these all of the time. Okay, so the diagonal pin stitch is very similar to the horizontal or vertical ones, but a big difference is when we place a diagonal pin stitch, it doesn't matter which way the weave of the fabric is running. They are worked the same regardless. So to start, I'm going to start by just bringing my needle down in the center of my starting square. And I'm going to leave a little bit of a tail. I'm just going to pin out of the way. And now I'm going to bring my needle up in the bottom left corner and then right back down through the center. And I'm going to repeat that in the opposite corner. So now we're bringing it up through the top right, right back down through the center. And now I'm going to trim the tail. And you can see essentially I've made the bottom leg of my stitch. So now I'm going to go ahead, keep stitching. And when I come back over, that little tail will be covered up and it will just look like a regular standard cross stitch. So in my most recent video, I showed, a modified loop start that you could do if you couldn't do a standard loop start for whatever reason. But this would be another option in those scenarios. And now you can see it just looks like a standard cross stitch. I love a starting diagonal pin stitch. And you might be thinking to yourself, ooh, can you also do those to end your stitches? You sure can. Fair warning, they are not my favorite, but I will show you anyways. They are, I think, a little bit tricky in the sense that they can come loose. You need to really make sure you are making them nice and secure. So let's say in my imaginary pattern here that this was my last stitch of this color. So, what I would want to do is actually skip the first leg of my stitch. So, again, I'm going to pretend that I'm just stitching these nice and neat rows. And again, I'm skipping the first leg of my last stitch. And I think this will make more sense when you see it. All right. So, again, my imaginary last stitch, what I'm going to do is actually place the top leg of my stitch. And I'm going to leave it a little loose here to begin, just so you can kind of see what I'm doing. But this is going to be very similar to the hidden pin stitch that we did earlier, but we're working it diagonally. So now I'm going to place the first leg of my stitch underneath, but I'm going to do it like a pin stitch. So I'm going to bring my needle down through the center. And now I want to pull it tight. And then I'm going to repeat it in this top corner. Now, there's a really important trick here. When you place this top leg, you need to make sure that you're really piercing the fibers of your floss. When you bring your needle back down through that center hole, I'm really making sure that I'm actually piercing the fibers of my floss here. That's going to be what really secures it. And then again, with my needle, just kind of fluff that up and trim it from the back. All right. And then that one does seem to be nice and secure. Again, I've had some issue with those coming loose. not the starting ones, but the ending ones. But that's your diagonal pin stitch. So that is how I tackle any and all pin stitches when I am stitching on Aida. But there's one last little trick I want to show you, and I feel like it's a place where the pin stitch really shines. And this is also something I get asked about a lot in my videos, and that is how to tackle a single stitch of a color when there are no other stitches around it on your canvas. And what I mean by that is you will literally on your pattern see maybe a single stitch of something and then it's all open fabric around it. A lot of times you see these if there's like stars or little highlights being added. And it's confusing. Like how can you start and stop a thread when there's nothing else around it to use to anchor? Now, some folks will just carry their thread all along the back. And while I do carry my threads along the back, I don't like to carry them across areas where there's just going to be blank fabric, like it's never going to get stitched over. The reason for that is just really erring on the side of caution, especially if you're using like a lighter colored fabric. If you have threads running along the back, sometimes you might be able to see them when you go to finish at the end. So my favorite way to tackle something like that is using a combination. I like to do a standard loop start to begin the thread, and then I will do a hidden pin stitch to end it. All right, so say we've got a singular stitch over here and there's nothing else around it on the entire pattern. It's just a little singular stitch out in the middle of nowhere. Now, what I would do is take a pretty short piece of floss and I would fold it in half. So a loop at one end and your loose threads on the other. And again, this is a short piece of floss because I want to be able to do a loop start and I don't want to waste a lot of thread. So I go ahead and thread my needle. So I've got the loose ends and that loop on the end. I'm going to place my stitch right here. So this is going to be a vertical hidden pin stitch to end because those threads are running vertically. So for my loop start, I'm going to bring my needle down in the top right corner and thread my needle through the loop and then bring my needle right down behind the loop. So my starting stitch is nice and secure. I'm going to finish it. And now I'm going to place a vertical pin stitch behind my cross stitch. So I'm separating the weave of the fabric in the bottom of the square. And then I'm working behind my stitch to place my needle through the center. Pull it tight and repeat on the top. Again, just making sure I'm getting my needle behind the stitch and through the center. Just kind of take my needle, just again, just kind of fluff it up. And I've trimmed the tail from the back. And now just to show you how secure it is, you can see I'm really getting in there and I cannot get that loose. So that is a super secure way to do a single stitch when there's going to be nothing filled in around it. And just to show you the back real quick. All right, that is what it looks like from the back. So now that you've learned all my tips and tricks when it comes to working your pin stitches on Aida, it is time to jump into working on even weaves and linens. So you'll notice in the first half of the video when we talked about working pin stitches on Aida fabric, in all of those demonstrations, I was stitching over one. Now, one, I do think that really is the best case scenario to be using pin stitches when you're stitching on Aida. And I think it's just also the way people more commonly stitch when they're working with Aida fabric. On the flip side, a lot of times when folks are working with even weaves and linens, they tend to be working over two squares. And again, that is where a pin stitch really does a great job when you're stitching on even weaves and linens and stitching over two. Now, You can technically still use pin stitches when you're stitching over one on linens and even weaves. I personally do not tend to do that just because I worry a little bit about like messing with the integrity of the fabric, but I will demonstrate that for you at the end. But first, we're going to focus on pin stitches when you are stitching over two on linens and even weaves. So, the steps that you're going to take to create a pin stitch when you're stitching over two are essentially the same, but the mechanics of it are going to be a little bit different. Instead of working directly in the weave of the fabric, we're going to be working with the center holes that are created when you're stitching over two. All right, so when we are stitching over two on an even weave like this, we really don't need to be concerned about which direction the weave of the fabric is going in. So whether it's horizontal or vertical doesn't really matter because when we stitch over two, I'm going to go down through the center hole here. So because of that, the direction that the weave is running in really will not matter. So let's go ahead and just create a starting vertical pin stitch that will get covered by our stitches. So I'm going to go ahead, bring my needle down again in that center hole because I'm stitching over two. Just like before, I'm going to leave a little bit of a tail and then I'm going to come up through the bottom center. And now the trick with a pin stitch when we're going over two, because we're not piercing the weave of the fabric, with our needle, we really want to pierce the fibers of our floss because this is what is essentially going to catch. And I'm going to repeat the process. So now I'm coming up through the top center. And again, when I come back down, I'm taking my needle and I really want to like pierce the fibers of my floss. I'm going to go ahead and give my tail a quick little trim. And now as I stitch over the pin stitch, it will essentially just disappear behind my stitches. It's not quite hidden in the weave of the fabric like it is when we're stitching on Aida, but it does still get covered up as you continue to stitch. And again, you can place these horizontally or vertically. It does not really matter. All right. And just like the example before, let's say I want to place an ending pin stitch. I'll show you the horizontal version and I'm just going to do it like a couple stitches below where I'm stitching right now. So I'm going to come up from one side down the middle. And again, just like before, I really want to make sure I'm piercing the fibers of my floss as I come back down through the center. And then I just snip that tail away from the back. Now, just like with the Aida, I only want to place these in an area that I know will eventually get covered by other stitches. So just to see what that looks like, we'll go ahead and repeat this process. This time I'm going to do a starting horizontal pin stitch. Again, I just want to make sure I'm piercing the fibers of my floss as much as possible. So we can already see that starting pin stitch is already pretty well covered up, even with that half a stitch. All right, so this was the ending pin stitch we placed earlier in a different color, just so you can really see that contrast. But even coming over that nice bright teal with the light purple, it still really disappears. So you can see even when you're stitching over two on an even weave, those vertical and horizontal pin stitches can work really well. Obviously, they're going to be more visible because we're not working them into the weave of the fabric, but they do still really get hidden once you cover up that area with stitches. So these can be a really good option, especially when you're stitching full coverage. Now, when I'm stitching over two, I find the vertical and horizontal pin stitches are useful to know, but I'm not really using them all that much. But just like when I'm stitching over one on Aida, I love using a diagonal pin stitch when I'm stitching over two on an even weave. Again, the step-by-step process is essentially the same. It's just the mechanics are slightly different. So the diagonal pin stitch is really going to be just like the vertical and horizontal ones, but like with the Aida, we are just creating the first leg of our stitch while we create the pin stitch. I do these all the time when I'm stitching over two on an even weave. All right, so just like with any other pin stitch, I'm going to start by bringing my needle down through the center hole of my starting stitch. I'm going to leave a little tail that I'm going to pin back with my finger. And now I'm going to come up in the bottom left. Again, the big trick here is that we want to be piercing the fiber of our floss as much as possible with our needle. And then same thing in the opposite corner. Again, trying to pierce our floss as much as possible. So we trim our tail and then just go ahead and keep stitching. And as we come back over, that initial pin stitch is going to be totally covered and it just looks like the first half of our stitch. And yes, we could do an ending diagonal pin stitch just like we could on Aida. These are not my favorite. I do not do them. I do find them to also be a little bit less secure. Again, you just really have to pierce the fibers of your floss. And if you're not doing a really good job with it, they're just not going to stick. And to me, it's not worth them possibly coming loose. But the process would be just the same as it is with Aida. So this time I skipped the first leg of this ending stitch. And I'm going to just create the top leg of the stitch first. And I'm going to keep it nice and loose just so I can really see what I'm doing. So I'm going to come up in the bottom, down through the center. Now I can pull it tight. Up in the top. And again, back down through the center, really trying to pierce my threads. All right, just fluff it up a little bit with my needle. And that's your ending diagonal pin stitch. All right, so now let's talk about using pin stitches when you're stitching over one on linens and even weaves. So, when you take a close look at your even weave or linen, just like with the Aida, we're going to see like a basket weave of interwoven fibers. The big difference though is when we look up close at our Aida, we see those four individual strands of thread creating the basket weave. But when we take a close look at our even weaves or linens, it's going to be a singular twisted strand of fiber. So when you place a pin stitch on an even weave like that, you're going to be essentially splitting that strand of fiber, opposed to Aida when you're kind of working within those individual groupings of threads. So for me personally, I do worry a little bit when I'm placing pin stitches working over one on an even weave, because I just worry the amount of splitting that's happening could affect the overall like integrity of the fabric. Also, in full transparency, at least for me, they are just like somewhat difficult to do. The fibers will like totally slip around on you. You need a really small needle to get it done. So they do end up just being a little bit more hassle than they're worth, but technically they are possible. Now, a different but kind of similar thing that I do end up using a lot when I'm stitching over one on an even weave is a tacking stitch. Now, they don't have the same security as a pin stitch, but they are way easier to place and they can really come in handy. So I'm going to show you those as well. All right. So now when we're stitching over one, we do still have that weave of the fabric that we're going to work in, but we don't have those, big grouping of individual threads like we do with the Aida. So we have to like pierce this kind of singular twisted strand. So let's go ahead and start with a horizontal pin stitch. Now I do find it tricky to pierce both the top and bottom thread, but it can be done. All right, and we'll come up through the side, back down the middle. Now you can see it's already kind of imperfect, but I mean, that's just kind of my experience trying to do a pin stitch over one on even weave or linen. But we'll snip that away. So those do disappear really nicely behind your stitches as you continue on. So now, instead of placing a pin stitch to end, I want to show you a tacking stitch. Like I mentioned earlier, I tend to use these a lot more when I'm stitching over one on a higher count fabric. So what I would do with a tacking stitch in particular is I'm actually going to bring my needle over about half an inch to maybe 1 inch total. And again, the weave does matter. I tend to do these horizontally, but you can do them either way. And I'm going to bring my needle up, splitting that thread horizontally, and then down on the other side. So instead of going down through the middle, I'm going down on the sides. Now, the concept here is there's obviously that tail running along the back. Now, this is not super secure. Okay. This can come loose pretty easily if I mess with it. But I have that tail running along the back. And as I continue to fill this area in with stitches, that tail would then get anchored. So that's how I use a tacking stitch. You can see they're a little bit similar to a pin stitch, that you're kind of piercing the weave of the fabric. And even though it's not as secure, I feel like because you're splitting the weave less by not going back down through the center twice, it kind of keeps the integrity of your fabric a little bit stronger. And the last one to show you if we're stitching over one is a diagonal starting pin stitch. So again, I'm going to pierce the center weave as best I can. Again, I do find it difficult to get both the top and the bottom. And just like with all of them, I'm going to leave a tail, just pin it out of the way. And I do want to take my time to make sure that I am, again, just kind of piercing the fibers of my floss as much as possible. So go ahead, trim your tail, and complete your stitches. I am not even going to attempt a ending diagonal pin stitch stitching over one, because again, I feel like it's just way more hassle than it's worth, and I know I will struggle, but you can get the general idea. Again, they're all like step by step work the same. The mechanics are just a little bit different depending on the fabric you're using and if you're stitching over 1 or 2 squares. So there you have it, everything you ever wanted to know about pin stitches. Let me know if you use any of these methods, and if so, which one is your favorite. And if I happen to miss some variation of a pin stitch that was not covered in this video, and yes, I would be embarrassed if that happened, but please do let me know in the comments. For me, if I'm stitching over 1 on Aida or over 2 on an Evenweave or linen, I love a diagonal pin stitch. If there's any scenario where I can't do just a standard loop start, the diagonal pin stitch is my go-to starting method. But I want to hear from you on what your favorites are. Once again, I'm Jackie from Adam Hart Cross Stitch. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video and want to see more content like this, please do all the good things, like, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, happy stitching.